The old station clock struck 2:15 as Henry Mitchell adjusted his worn leather satchel and squinted at the departure board. At 73, he'd grown accustomed to these small adventures, weekend trips to nowhere in particular, anything to fill the endless hours since retirement. The teaching career that had once consumed 45 years of his life now felt like a distant echo. He'd begun teaching at 25 in 1962, fresh from graduate school, and had watched generations of students pass through the halls of Millbrook High. Platform 7 for the Heritage Railway, announced a tinny voice over the speaker system. All aboard for a journey through time. Henry chuckled at the theatrical marketing. Tourism companies these days seem to promise magic around every corner. Still, the antique steam engine did look magnificent, its brass fittings gleaming in the afternoon sun like something from his childhood. He found his reserved seat in Car 3, a plush, burgundy booth that faced forward toward the locomotive. The upholstery smelled of old leather and lemon oil, reminding him of his grandfather's study. As he settled in, placing his satchel beside him, his fingers brushed against the small metal keyring from his old school desk, a habit he'd never quite broken. He noticed he wasn't alone. A young woman, perhaps in her late 20s, sat across from him. She had striking green eyes and auburn hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Something about her seemed familiar, though Henry was certain they'd never met. Lately, his memories had been playing tricks on him. Recent events felt distant while old ones seemed impossibly vivid. "First time on the Heritage Line?" she asked, her voice carrying a slight accent he couldn't quite place. "Yes," Henry replied, grateful for the company. "Though I have to admit, I'm not entirely sure what I've signed up for." The brochure was rather vague. The young woman smiled, a knowing sort of expression that made Henry slightly uncomfortable. "Oh, this train is special," she said, glancing toward the window as the locomotive's whistle echoed across the platform. "Some say it doesn't just travel through the countryside, it travels through time itself." Henry laughed politely. "Well, that would certainly be worth the ticket price, would it?" she asked, her green eyes studying his face with unexpected intensity. "Are you so eager to revisit the past, Professor Mitchell?" The use of his old title startled him. He hadn't been called professor since his retirement 3 years ago, and even then, it was just Mr. Mitchell to his high school students. "I'm sorry. Do we know each other?" Before she could answer, the train lurched forward with a gentle rhythm that quickly became hypnotic. Henry turned to look out the window, expecting to see the familiar industrial outskirts of the city rolling past. Instead, he froze. The landscape outside was wrong. Completely wrong. Where there should have been shopping centers and housing developments, he saw rolling farmland dotted with red barns. Where there should have been 4-lane highways, he saw narrow country roads with wooden fence posts. And there, his breath caught in his throat, there was Miller's General Store, exactly as it had looked when he was a boy. But Miller's General Store had been torn down in 1987. Henry pressed his face to the glass, his heart beginning to race. The fields, the farmhouses, even the style of cars parked along the country roads, everything looked exactly as it had in 1962, when he'd first taken his teaching position at Millbrook High. There was the old Brennan farm with its distinctive weathered mailbox, the covered bridge spanning Miller's Creek, and beyond it, the path that led through the woods where he used to walk as a young man. "Remarkable, isn't it?" the young woman said softly. "How clearly we can remember places we thought we'd forgotten." Henry turned back to her, his mouth dry. "This isn't possible. That store, those farms, they're all gone. Have been for decades." "Are they?" she asked, tilting her head. "Or perhaps we're the ones who are gone." The train's whistle sounded again, longer this time, mournful and distant. Henry felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. He looked around the car, noticing for the first time how few passengers there were and how still they all sat, staring out their windows with expressions of deep concentration. "I don't understand," he whispered. The young woman reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Her skin was surprisingly warm. "You will, grandfather," she said gently. "Before this journey ends." Henry stared at her in shock. He struggled to remember his family clearly. The memories seemed fragmented lately. His wife Margaret had disappeared decades ago, and they'd never had children together. His second marriage to Ruth had given him a daughter, Sarah, but she had died in a car accident 5 years ago. Sarah had a daughter, he thought, but the details felt hazy, uncertain. "I think you have me confused with someone else," he managed to say, but the young woman just smiled that same knowing smile and turned back to the window, where the impossible landscape of Henry's youth continued to roll past like a half-remembered dream made manifest. The train pressed on, carrying them deeper into a yesterday that should no longer exist. Henry sat in stunned silence, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the armrest of his seat. The young woman who claimed to be his granddaughter had returned her attention to the window, humming a melody he recognized but couldn't quite place. Outside, the impossible landscape continued to unfold. He saw the old Brennan farm with its distinctive red silo, the covered bridge over Miller's Creek, and the white steeple of Street Mary's church rising above the oak trees. All of it exactly as it had been in 1962, down to the last detail. But something nagged at him. Margaret had disappeared in 2002. He was certain of it. The new millennium. The September 11th attacks fresh in everyone's memory. The world already feeling different and strange. This has to be some sort of historical recreation. A theme park, or is that what you tell yourself about everything that doesn't fit? The young woman asked, without turning from the window. That it must be fake? Henry didn't answer. Instead, he reached for his satchel, thinking perhaps his reading glasses might help make sense of what he was seeing. As he fumbled with the clasp, something crinkled beneath his fingers, paper that hadn't been there before. He pulled out a newspaper, yellowed with age and folded neatly in half. The masthead read, "The Millbrook Gazette," in the familiar typeface he remembered from his youth. But it was the date that made his blood run cold. October 15th, 1962. "Where did this come from?" he whispered. The young woman glanced over. "Perhaps the better question is when it came from." Henry's hand shook as he unfolded the paper. The front page featured familiar local news from 6 decades past. The high school football team's victory over their rivals, the mayor's plans for a new library, a photograph of the annual Harvest Festival that he distinctly remembered attending as a young teacher. But as his eyes scanned down the page, they stopped at a headline that made the world seem to tilt around him. "Local teacher questioned in wife's disappearance. Police consider Henry Mitchell person of interest." The article began, "Millbrook High School history teacher Henry Mitchell, 25, was brought in for questioning yesterday regarding the sudden disappearance of his wife, Margaret Mitchell, 22. Mrs. Mitchell was last seen leaving the school where she worked as a secretary on the evening of October 12th. Police Chief Robert Walsh stated that while no charges have been filed, Mr. Mitchell remains a person of interest in the ongoing investigation." Henry's vision blurred. This was impossible. Margaret hadn't disappeared in 1962, that was 40 years later, in 2002, and he had never been questioned by police, never been considered a suspect. The investigation had been routine, perfunctory even. She had simply vanished one day, and despite extensive searches, no trace of her was ever found. "This is wrong," he said aloud, his voice cracking. "All wrong. Margaret disappeared in 2002, not 1962. And I was never a suspect." The young woman turned to face him fully now, her green eyes filled with something that might have been pity. "Are you certain about that, grandfather? Memory can be such a fragile thing, especially when we've spent so many years protecting ourselves from painful truths." "Don't call me that," Henry snapped, then immediately felt ashamed of his outburst. "I'm sorry, but you're mistaken. Margaret and we were trying for children, but she disappeared before." He trailed off, staring at the newspaper again. Below the main article was a smaller piece with the headline, "Missing Woman's Family Demands Answers." The article mentioned Margaret's younger sister, Lydia, who was quoted as saying, "My sister was afraid of something, or someone. She called me the night before she vanished. Said she'd discovered something terrible about Henry." A smaller item caught his eye. "Missing woman's sister reports Margaret mentioned the path behind Brennan Farm in her final phone call, though the significance remains unclear." "I don't remember any of this," Henry whispered. "Lydia never said that. Margaret was never afraid of me. She loved me." "Did she?" the young woman asked softly. "Or is that just what you needed to believe?" The train began to slow, and Henry looked up to see they were approaching a small station. The sign read Millbrook Junction in fresh paint, though he knew for a fact that the station had been demolished in the 1970s to make way for a shopping mall. Several passengers began to stir and move toward the exits, but Henry noticed something odd about them. They moved in perfect silence, their faces turned away from him, as if deliberately avoiding eye contact. "We're not getting off here," the young woman said, noting his confusion. "This stop isn't for us. Not yet." As the train pulled away from the impossible station, Henry found himself staring at the newspaper again, reading and rereading the article about his younger self being questioned in his wife's disappearance. The more he read, the more fragments of buried memories began to surface, memories he was certain had never existed before. Police Chief Walsh asking him to come to the station, just to clear up a few details. Margaret's sister Lydia, her eyes red with tears and accusations. The whispers that followed him through the school hallways for weeks afterward. How could he have forgotten all of this? How could such traumatic memories simply disappear? "Because," the young woman said, as if reading his thoughts, "sometimes forgetting is the only way to survive." The train whistle sounded again, a mournful note that seemed to echo not just through the countryside, but through the corridors of Henry's mind, where doors long locked were beginning to creak open. Henry folded the newspaper carefully and placed it back in his satchel, but he could still feel its presence like a burning coal against his chest. Outside the window, the landscape of his youth continued to roll past, beautiful and terrible and impossibly real. And somewhere in the depths of his memory, a voice, Margaret's voice, was whispering words he had spent 40 years trying not to hear. Henry tucked the impossible newspaper deeper into his satchel, trying to push down the rising panic that threatened to overwhelm him. The train had picked up speed again, and the rhythmic clacking of wheels on tracks seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. "I think I need some air," he murmured, standing unsteadily. "Perhaps I'll take a walk through the other cars." The young woman nodded without looking at him. "Yes," she said quietly. "I think it's time you met the other passengers." Henry made his way toward the front of the train, gripping seat backs for support as the car swayed gently. The first car he entered was nearly empty, except for an elderly man sitting alone by the window. As Henry approached, the man looked up, and Henry's breath caught in his throat. "Well, I'll be damned," the man said with a familiar gravelly voice. "Henry Mitchell, fancy seeing you here." It was Frank Walsh, Chief of Police Frank Walsh, though he looked exactly as he had in 1962, not a day older despite the fact that he should have been dead for 15 years. "Frank," Henry whispered. "But you, how are you?" "Sit down, son," Frank said, patting the seat beside him. "We need to talk." Henry sat heavily, his legs suddenly weak. "You died in 2008. I went to your funeral." Frank chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. Death's just another kind of journey, Henry. Sometimes it takes you places you never expected. He turned to face Henry fully, his weathered face serious. You know why I'm here, don't you? I don't know why any of this is happening. Don't you? Frank's eyes were sharp, penetrating. 40 years I've been waiting for you to tell the truth about that night, about what really happened to Margaret. Henry shook his head frantically. I told you everything back then. I came home from parent-teacher conferences and she was gone. Her purse was still there, her car was in the driveway, but she was just gone. You told me a lot of things, Frank said slowly. But the scratches on your hands, Henry, fresh scratches, and that muddy shovel in your garage, the one you claimed you'd been using for yard work, though your neighbor said he'd seen you driving toward Miller's Creek that very night. His voice dropped. Where did you bury her, son? I didn't. She's not. Henry stumbled over the words, then stood abruptly. I can't do this. He hurried toward the next car, Frank's voice following him. You can't run from it forever, son. Not on this train. The second car was more crowded, but Henry pressed forward, desperate to escape Frank's accusing eyes. 3 seats ahead sat a figure that made him stop cold. A young man turned to face him, his own face from 40 years ago, 25 years old and carrying the weight of terrible secrets. Hello, Henry, his younger self said calmly. I've been wondering when you'd show up. This isn't real, Henry gasped, gripping the back of a chair to keep from falling. None of this is real. His younger self smiled, a cold expression Henry didn't remember ever wearing. Real enough. Sit down. We have a lot to discuss. Against his better judgment, Henry sat across from himself, staring into eyes that held secrets he had buried so deep he'd almost convinced himself they never existed. You know what you did, the younger Henry said quietly. You know what we did. I don't remember. You remember everything. The athletics fund money, $3,000 for Mother's cancer treatments. Margaret keeping the books, finding the discrepancy, her ultimatum, confess or she would. The younger Henry leaned forward. You remember following her to Miller's Creek that night. Stop, Henry whispered. You remember the argument on the old stone bridge. Her standing up, saying she was going to the principal Monday morning. Your desperate grab for her arm. His voice dropped to a whisper. You remember how she pulled away, lost her balance, fell. It was an accident, Henry said, his voice breaking. Was it? Or was it a moment of relief when you realized she couldn't tell anyone anymore? The younger Henry's eyes were pitiless. And what happened after, Henry? When she was lying there unconscious, bleeding, but still breathing? You could have run for help, but you didn't. The memory came flooding back with horrible clarity. Margaret lying unconscious by the creek, blood pooling beneath her head from where she'd struck the stone bridge. And Henry, 25 years old and terrified, watching her shallow breathing and making the most cowardly decision of his life. He had waited until her breathing stopped, waited until he was sure she was gone. Then he had retrieved the shovel from his car trunk and buried her in the woods behind the Brennan farm, the soft earth yielding to his desperate digging. I was young. I was scared, Henry whispered. I panicked. You chose, his younger self corrected. You chose your reputation over her life. You chose to let her die rather than face the consequences of what you'd done. Henry stood abruptly, but there was nowhere to run on the moving train. Around him, he became aware that other passengers were watching, all faces from his past, all people who had been touched by his lies. He stumbled back toward his original car, past the impossible passengers, past his younger self who sat watching with that terrible knowing smile. When he reached his seat, the young woman was exactly as he'd left her. Now do you remember, grandfather? She asked softly, not turning from the window. And with a horror that seemed to reach into his very soul, Henry realized why her eyes were so familiar. They were Margaret's eyes. Margaret's eyes in the face of the daughter who should have been born, the granddaughter who should have existed if he had made different choices on that terrible night. You're not Emma, he whispered. I'm the daughter Margaret was carrying when she died, she said simply. The daughter you killed along with her. The granddaughter you never got to meet because of your cowardice. The train whistle sounded again, long and mournful, and Henry felt the weight of 40 years of lies pressing down on him like the earth he should have used to save his wife instead of hiding her. Henry collapsed into his seat, his breath coming in short gasps. The young woman, Margaret's daughter, the granddaughter who never was, sat watching him with those familiar green eyes that held the weight of decades. You spoke with them, she said. It wasn't a question. They know. They all know what I did. But how is that possible? Frank died years ago. Memory is a strange thing, grandfather. Sometimes we think we're remembering the past, when really we're finally seeing the present clearly for the first time. The train began to slow, though Henry could see no station ahead. Only a long tunnel carved into a hillside, its mouth as black as midnight. The locomotive's whistle sounded again, but this time it seemed to stretch on forever, a mournful wail that seemed to echo from the depths of his soul. We're going into the tunnel, the young woman said. This is where time stops, grandfather. This is where you have to choose. As the train entered the darkness, the lights in their car began to dim one by one. Henry found himself gripping the armrest so tightly his knuckles turned white. Choose what? He whispered. Whether to remember everything or to forget again, whether to face the truth or to spend eternity running from it. In the absolute darkness of the tunnel, Henry felt something shift around him. The steady rhythm of wheels on tracks began to slow, then fade entirely, until there was only silence. Even his own heartbeat seemed muted, distant. Then, gradually, images began to appear in the darkness, not seen with his eyes, but projected directly into his mind like scenes from an old film reel. He saw himself at 25, standing in the principal's office at Millbrook High School. The athletics fund was short nearly $3,000, money he had borrowed to pay for his mother's cancer treatments, intending to replace it before anyone noticed. But Margaret had been keeping the books. Margaret had discovered the discrepancy. He saw Margaret in their small kitchen, tears streaming down her face as she pleaded with him. Henry, please, just put the money back. Tell them it was a mistake, an accounting error. We can work this out. But he had been so angry, so terrified of losing everything, his job, his reputation, his future. You don't understand, he had shouted. My mother is dying. I couldn't let her die because we couldn't afford the treatments. There were other ways, Margaret had sobbed. We could have asked for help, taken out a loan, anything but stealing from the school. The argument had stretched on for hours. Margaret had threatened to go to the police herself if he didn't confess. She had been 3 months pregnant, finally, after 2 years of trying, and she had looked at him with such disappointment, such fear. I can't raise a child with a thief, she had said, her hand instinctively moving to her stomach. I won't. In the darkness of the tunnel, Henry saw the rest of that terrible night unfolding with crystal clarity. He had followed Margaret to Miller's Creek, where she had gone to think, to pray, to decide what to do. He had found her sitting on the old stone bridge, staring down at the water. Margaret, please, he had begged. Don't do this. Don't destroy everything we've built together. But she had stood up resolute. I'm going to Mr. Patterson first thing Monday morning. I'm going to tell him everything. The desperation had overwhelmed him. Not rage, desperation. The desperate grab for her arm, trying to make her listen, trying to make her understand. She had pulled away, lost her balance, and fallen backward, her head striking the stone edge of the bridge with a sound that would haunt him forever. It was an accident, Henry whispered into the darkness of the tunnel. I never meant for her to fall. I was just trying to make her understand. But what happened next, grandfather? The young woman's voice came from somewhere in the blackness. After she fell? Henry closed his eyes, though it made no difference in the absolute darkness. The memory came flooding back. The most shameful moment of his life. Margaret lying unconscious by the creek, blood pooling beneath her head from where she'd struck the bridge, her breathing shallow but steady, still alive, still savable, ill, and Henry, 25 years old and paralyzed by terror, had knelt beside her and done nothing. She was still breathing, Henry said, his voice breaking. For almost 10 minutes, she was still breathing. I could have run for help, called an ambulance, something. But I was so afraid that if she survived, she would still tell them about the money, afraid that everyone would know what I had done. So you waited, the voice continued. You waited until she stopped breathing. You waited until you were sure she was gone. And then I went back to the car for the shovel. I carried her into the woods behind the Brennan farm. I dug in the soft earth beneath the oak trees. I buried her where I thought no one would ever find her. The weight of it, 40 years of lies, 40 years of living with the knowledge that he had chosen his own cowardice over his wife's life, pressed down on him like the earth he had shoveled over her grave. The baby, too, he whispered. Our daughter. I killed them both through my cowardice. Yes, the voice said, and suddenly the darkness began to lift slightly. My mother. The mother I never got to meet because of your fear. Henry could see her now, sitting across from him as the lights in the train car slowly began to return, but she looked different, older, sadder, more real somehow. You're not really my granddaughter, are you? He asked. She shook her head slowly. I'm the daughter you never had. The daughter Margaret was carrying when she died. I'm the life that was lost because you chose fear over courage, self-preservation over love. The train was moving again now, emerging from the tunnel into a strange twilight landscape that seemed to exist between day and night, between past and present. Henry could see other passengers beginning to stir, beginning to move toward the exits. What happens now? He asked. Now you choose, she said, standing and smoothing down her dress. The train is approaching its final station. You can get off and face what you've done. Tell the truth you should have told 40 years ago. Or you can stay on the train forever, with us, with all the lives that were touched by your choices. Henry looked around the car and saw them all clearly now, not just Margaret and their unborn daughter, but Chief Walsh, who had spent months searching for a woman Henry knew was dead. All the people who had trusted him, believed in him, mourned with him, never knowing they were comforting the very person responsible for their grief. I don't know if I can do it, Henry said. I don't know if I can face them all, tell them what I really did. 40 years of lies. How do you undo 40 years of lies? One truth at a time, Margaret's voice came from behind him. He turned, and there she was, not as the young woman who claimed to be their daughter, but as herself, exactly as she had looked on their wedding day. Beautiful, kind, with those same green eyes that seemed to hold infinite forgiveness. Margaret, he breathed. Hello, Henry, she said softly. I've been waiting such a long time for you to remember. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I never meant for it to happen, and afterwards, I was just so scared. She reached out and touched his face gently. I know, my love. I know. But fear is a choice, just like courage is. And now you have to choose again. The train began to slow as they approached a station that looked exactly like the one where Henry's journey had begun. The conductor's voice crackled over the intercom. Final stop, Millbrook Station. All passengers wishing to return to the present, please prepare to disembark. This train will be continuing on to destinations unknown. Henry looked at Margaret, at their daughter who never was, at all the passengers whose lives had been changed by his 40-year-old choice. Then he looked out the window at the platform where a life of truth, difficult, painful, but honest, waited for him. If I get off, he said, what happens to you? To all of you. Margaret smiled, and for a moment she looked exactly like the young woman who had first spoken to him on the train. We'll always be with you, Henry, in every honest word you speak from now on, in every moment you choose courage over fear, in every step you take toward making things right. The train shuddered to a complete stop. The doors hissed open. Henry stood up on trembling legs, his heart pounding with a mixture of terror and hope. For the first time in 40 years, he was about to stop running from the truth. As he stepped toward the door, Margaret's voice followed him one last time. "Remember, my love, it's never too late to choose differently." Henry Mitchell, 73 years old, stepped off the train and onto the platform, leaving behind 4 decades of lies and carrying with him the weight and the freedom of the truth. Behind him, the train whistle sounded one final time as it pulled away into the gathering darkness, carrying its impossible passengers toward whatever destination awaits those whose stories can only be told in the spaces between memory and dream. Henry found himself standing on an empty platform, the sound of the train fading into the distance like a half-remembered dream. But the weight in his chest, the crushing certainty of what he had done, remained as real as his own heartbeat. The station around him shimmered and began to change. The old-fashioned architecture blurred, the wooden benches transformed into modern plastic chairs, and the gaslight fixtures became harsh fluorescent bulbs. He was no longer on a train platform. He was lying in a bed, staring up at a white ceiling with water stains in the corners. The smell of antiseptic and cafeteria food filled his nostrils. Medical equipment beeped softly nearby. "Grandpa, Grandpa, are you awake?" Henry turned his head and saw her, the young woman from the train, but different now. Older, more solid, wearing jeans and a college sweatshirt instead of the timeless clothes she'd worn on their journey. Her green eyes, Margaret's eyes, looked at him with concern and love. "Emma," he whispered, the name coming to him as if from a great distance. "Yes, Grandpa, it's Emma. You've been having another episode." She reached for his hand, her touch warm and real. "Do you remember where you are?" The memories came flooding back, not the false memories of trains and impossible passengers, but real ones. Emma Chen, his granddaughter through his daughter Sarah, who had been visiting him in the memory care facility for months. The episodes were becoming more frequent, more vivid. Sometimes he confused the past with the present. Sometimes he remembered things that never happened. But sometimes he remembered things he had tried very hard to forget. "The therapy sessions," he said slowly, his voice hoarse. "The memory recovery treatment. It was all to help me remember?" Emma nodded, tears gathering in her eyes, Margaret's eyes, inherited through some strange genetic echo. "The doctor said your memories were fragmenting, but also surfacing. Things from long ago that you'd buried. They thought if we could help you work through them." Henry looked down at his hands, old and spotted now, but somehow he could still see the mud beneath his fingernails from that terrible night 40 years ago. The weight of what he'd done was still there, but now it felt different, manageable, real. "I have to tell someone," he said. "The police, someone in authority, Lydia, if she's still alive. I have to." "Grandpa," Emma said gently, holding up her hand. In it was a train ticket, an old-fashioned cardboard stub with Heritage Railway printed across the top, dated that very day. "I found this in your hand when you woke up. Do you remember where you got it?" Henry stared at the ticket, his heart racing. It was real as the weight of truth in his chest, as real as the memories he could no longer deny, as real as the choice he now had to make. "That's impossible. The train, it was all in my mind. Part of the therapy." Emma's expression was puzzled, slightly frightened. "What train, Grandpa? There is no Heritage Railway. There never was. And this ticket, I've never seen anything like it. The paper, the printing, it looks like it's from decades ago." Henry took the ticket with trembling fingers. As he did, he noticed something else in Emma's other hand, a small, mud-stained object that made his breath catch in his throat. A metal key ring, his old school key ring, the one he'd lost in the woods behind Brennan Farm 40 years ago while burying Margaret. Where did you find that?" he whispered. Emma looked confused. "This? It was in your other hand. Grandpa, you're scaring me. What is all this?" Henry sat up in bed, his mind suddenly crystal clear. The key ring, the ticket, impossible evidence of an impossible journey. But the memories were real, the guilt was real, and most importantly, the choice was real. "Emma," he said, gripping her hand, "I need you to call someone for me. Detective Morrison at the county police. He handles cold cases. Tell him Henry Mitchell wants to confess to the murder of his wife, Margaret." "Grandpa, no. You're confused. Your wife, my grandma Margaret. She died in a car accident in 2002. Remember? You showed me her grave." "No," Henry said firmly, the truth flowing through him like a cleansing flood. "That's what I told everyone. That's the lie I've lived with for 40 years. But Margaret Mitchell disappeared in October 1962, and I know exactly where she's buried." He looked out the window of the memory care facility, where autumn leaves were falling like the tears he'd never allowed himself to shed. In the distance, he could see the old station clock tower, its hands frozen at 2:15, the same time his journey had begun, or perhaps the time it had always been meant to end. "Tell Detective Morrison to bring a team to the woods behind what used to be Brennan Farm, about 50 yards northwest from Miller's Creek Bridge, between the distinctive split-trunk oak tree and the creek bed. She's been waiting there for 40 years for someone to find her." Emma stared at him in shock, the impossible ticket and keyring still clutched in her hands. "Grandpa, I don't understand. How do you have these things? Where did they come from?" Henry smiled sadly, feeling lighter than he had in decades. "Sometimes, Emma, we need to take a journey before we can find our way home. Sometimes the only way to face the future is to finally, truly, visit the past." Outside the window he could swear he heard the distant sound of a train whistle, calling across the years like a promise finally kept. Some journeys, Henry realized, don't end when you reach your destination. They end when you finally understand why you needed to take them in the first place. Emma sat quietly, still holding the impossible evidence of his journey. The ticket that shouldn't exist, the keyring that had been buried with his lies for 40 years. Slowly, she reached for her phone. "Detective Morrison," she said when the call connected. "This is Emma Chen. I'm calling about my grandfather, Henry Mitchell. He says he needs to tell you about something that happened in 1962. As Emma spoke with the detective, arranging for the team that would finally bring Margaret home, Henry closed his eyes and felt, for the first time in 40 years, the weight of peace settling over him like a benediction. The train had brought him exactly where he needed to go, not back to the past, but forward into the truth. And in that truth, strange and difficult as it was, he had finally found his way home. The ticket crumbled to dust in Emma's hand as she finished the call, but the keyring remained solid and real, a small piece of evidence that would soon help a grieving sister finally lay her beloved Margaret to rest. Some trains, perhaps, exist not in the world we see, but in the places where memory, guilt, and redemption intersect, carrying passengers not through space and time, but through the landscapes of the human heart, toward the only destination that had ever truly mattered: the truth.